Hello, and today we will be looking at marine science for IGCSE, and we will be looking at section 4.3, which deal with photosynthesis. As always, this is just made for me and my class, but if anyone else can use it, you're more than welcome to. And any errors here are mine and mine alone and does not reflect on either Cambridge or my school. So we're going to have a go at this chapter here. It's a quite short one, but there's some very important parts of it. And also, if you've ever done IGCSE biology, you'll find a lot of overlap here between what we do here and what is in the IGCSE biology syllabus. So let's get going. So when we talk about organisms, we can either have autotrophs, which means they make their own energy, or heterotrophs like me, who need their energy from somewhere else, in this case a teacher, from coffee. And when we talk about autotrophs, we have the photoautotrophs, which use light energy, and then we have the chemoautotrophs, which use chemical energy. And in this chapter here, we're only going to talk about the photoautotrophs, which do photosynthesis. And the three main groups doing this are the marine plants, as we talked about, the seagrass, the mangroves, and so on. And then, even more important, we have the micro and the macroalgae, the small plankton, all the way up to the big kelp forest. And then we have some bacteria, like cyanobacteria, who can also do photosynthesis. These are, without doubt, the most important organisms in our ocean because they power 99% of all the food chains. They also deliver the oxygen and they take up a lot of the carbon dioxide. So they are super important. On land, it's quite easy to see where we have the photoautotrophs because we have the grassland and we have the forest. In the ocean, when we move away from the kelp forest and the seagrass, which we only have like close to the coast, most of the photosynthesis will happen from algae floating in the ocean. And they might not look at much, but there are so many of them that in the end, they contribute a lot to the food chains, to the creation of oxygen, and so on. So photosynthesis is a quite complicated process. But the way we're looking at it here in IGCSE Marine is just scratching the surface. We are not going into the different pathways in the cell. We are not going into where we have the uptake of CO2 and so on. The reason why I'm saying this is that if this is the first time you look at something like photosynthesis, be aware that there's a lot more to it. This is a highly complicated process, but the important thing is that we have some carbon dioxide, some CO2, and we have water. And together with the light energy, that gives us sugar, C6H12O6, and it gives us oxygen. So this is one of the formulas you absolutely have to be able to remember when we go to the IGCSE final. The good thing is, if you flip this formula around, you get the formula for respiration, which you also have to know for the exam. So if you know one of them, you know the other one as well. Just be aware that there's a lot more going on. But the end process is we have some sugar, which means we have fixated carbon, and we have some oxygen, which then, in the case in the marine, goes into the water. Now, the magic of photosynthesis happen inside the chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are structures we see in plant cells. We'll also see them in the algae cells. And the chloroplasts contains the molecule chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a molecule that, when hit by light, captures the energy and thereby powers the entire process of photosynthesis. Now, as I said, the real process is way more complicated, but for IGCSE Marine, it's just important that you know that the molecule is called chlorophyll and it's usually found inside the chloroplasts. Now we're going to have a look at the different factors that affect photosynthesis. And the most important one, well, they're all important, but the first one is, of course, light. Without light, we can't have any photosynthesis. On land, that's why we see the trees growing higher so they can get more light. In the ocean, the main thing that determines how much light you get is how close you are to the surface, because light doesn't penetrate that far down into water. If we have clear water, of course, we can have photosynthesis down to like maybe 50, 100 meters. But if the water is full of mud, sand, there's a lot of that going on, the light won't penetrate very far. So most of the photosynthesis will happen in the upper part of the ocean, where we have the most light going on. That's also why we only see stuff like kelp and seagrass growing close to the coast where the water is shallow because they need to anchor. And out in the open ocean, you will see floating algae, microalgae, which will try to be close to the surface so they can have enough light to do photosynthesis. So if there's no light, there's no photosynthesis. And if there's less light, as we go further down, the rate of photosynthesis will go down. Another factor that affects photosynthesis is temperature. All chemical reactions, they run better at 20 degrees than they do at 10 degrees. And that goes for the enzymes doing photosynthesis as well. So if the water is very cold, photosynthesis will be slower. And if it's warm, it will be faster. Of course, there's a limit to this. If the water gets too warm, we can get a reduction in the rate again. But as we see here on the graph, normally we have the warmest water closest to the surface. Warm water has a lower density, so it will be on the top of the water column. This is another reason why we see the photosynthesis only happening in the top part of the ocean. Further down, there's no light, and it's also way colder. So temperature is another limiting factor. If it's too cold, the rate of photosynthesis will go down. Now, if you remember the formula for photosynthesis, and I hope you do, it requires water and carbon dioxide. So, of course, the concentration of carbon dioxide is also going to have an effect on the rate of photosynthesis. In general, we see that there's a lower concentration of carbon dioxide in the upper part of the ocean. And that is because, especially during day, we have so much photosynthesis going on that the photoautotrophs are using up the CO2. As you go further down, we'll have a higher concentration of CO2, both because there's fewer photoautotrophs, also because as the temperature decreases, solubility of CO2 goes up. So we'll tend to have a lower concentration of CO2 close to the surface. Now, due to human activities, there's almost always enough CO2 since we are increasing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere quite rapidly. So diffusion from the atmosphere will usually mean there will be more than enough CO2 to power photosynthesis. Then we get to one that's really important out in the open ocean, which is mineral ions. Because yes, from photosynthesis alone, we can build C6H12O6, simple sugar. But if we want to build more complex molecules, proteins, DNA, and so on, we also need things like phosphate, nitrate, iron, and other ions, magnesium, calcium, so on. And in many cases, they can be a limiting factor. When we are close to the coast, we will have a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus washing out both from farming and from runoff from the fields. But we get out in the middle of the ocean, there tend to be way less. And since the ocean is quite deep, a lot of the nutrients will then fall down as marine snow to the bottom. So we have a lot of nutrients lying at the bottom of the ocean, but close to the surface, where we have the sunlight, where we have the high temperature, there is less nutrients for growth. As we'll look at later, this has a huge effect on where on our planet we tend to see the highest primary production. So nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, magnesium, and so on can very easily be a limiting factor, because even if there is all the heat, all the CO2, all the sunlight we can ever need, if there is no nutrients, photosynthesis will be slow, and especially building up of proteins, building up of organic matter will be a lot slower. When we talk about photosynthesis in the ocean, we often talk about what we call the law of limiting factor, which means there's always be one thing that will limit how much primary production there is going to be. So, for example, if we are at the ocean near Greenland in winter, we might have a lot of nutrients, but it's very cold and there's no sunlight. So in this case, sunlight will be the limiting factor. If we are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean on a warm summer day, there's a lot of light, there's plenty of CO2, it's hot, but there are very little nitrate, there's very little nitrogen in the water. So in that case, that will be the limiting factor. So when we look at all the different factors that can limit our primary production, sunlight, temperature, CO2, nutrients, there's always be one of them that is the lowest. And the lowest one will determine how high the primary production is. So if our nutrients are low, it won't do any good increasing CO2. Nutrients will still be the limiting factor that determines our primary production. So here we see a map made by NASA, which shows the global distribution of chlorophyll that can be seen from satellites. And the greener it is, or even the redder, the more chlorophyll there is, which means the more algae and marine plants we have. And as you can see, there are parts of the ocean where there's a lot of photosynthesis happening, there's a lot of primary production, and there's huge parts where there's very little. This is due to the fact that the limiting factor in the open ocean tend to be nutrients. So when we have oceans close to land, there tend to be a lot of nutrients coming from the river, washing out from the land. But when we are out in the middle of the open ocean, we only get nutrients when we have upwelling, as for example we see next to the coast of Chile, where we have an upwelling going on. We also see upwellings down south of South America. So this is just to show that for a huge part of the ocean, we actually have a quite small primary production, simply due to the fact that nutrients are the one thing we are lacking. On the other hand, this also helps to explain why, for example, in the inner Danish Ocean, we tend to have too much algae growth, because we have a lot of nutrients and we end up having so much algae growth that it ends up spoiling some of our food chains and leading to hypoxia, anoxia at the bottom of the ocean due to eutrophication. This is just a little outside the syllabus, but it's just important to know how the global pattern is to understand the role of the different limiting factors. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you next time.